So you're living with obesity, and are you living in a disease state, or do you have a disease? So I talked about in the last video the homeostatic mechanism of the brain, that kind of what I call the lizard part of the brain, even though it's not technically the lizard part, but just kind of bear with me. So it's kind of that part of the brain that sets a set point for your body weight. So let's say, your healthy body weight should be about 150 pounds or 130 pounds. Let's say 150 pounds. But for some reason, the set point has gone up. That thermometer in your brain, in the hypothalamus, that homeostatic part says, well, no, you should be 300 pounds. So you try to lose weight. And then what happens? You lose weight, and then the weight comes back up until you hit 300 pounds again. And no matter what you do, it just keeps on going back up to that set point. So that's a part of the argument of what I made about how we call disease, or how we look at obesity as being a disease state. But wait a sec, that's only one layer out of 3 layers of the brain. We've only talked about that lizard part. So today I'm going to talk to you about the second layer of the brain, because we're talking about, is obesity a disease? The second layer being the hedonic layer of the brain. Now keep in mind that weight which you have, or that set point, maybe it's 300 pounds. It's not occurring in a vacuum. What is driving that set point to go up to 300 pounds? Why would your body change from a healthy set point at 150 pounds and go up to 300 pounds, even though you're going to suffer all those downstream effects because of that high set point as a result of that increased weight? Stuff like, my back hurts, and I'm getting arthritis in my knees, and I'm getting athlete's foot fungus, and I'm getting diabetes and diabetic retinopathy, and I'm, getting angina, and I've got a stroke, and, I'm getting renal failure, my kidneys are failing, and I'm getting skin tags, right? You see those skin tags around the neck. Like, why would your body put that set point up? Like, what's the reason? This is where that second layer of the brain comes in, the hedonic layer. What is the hedonic layer of the brain? So the first layer, the lizard, incredibly powerful, right? But this layer is also incredibly powerful. Hedonic means the pleasure part of the brain, the part of the brain that gives you that, ecstasy and happiness and feeling that incredible sense of pleasure, right? Hedonic part, this is called the limbic system, where, you've heard about stuff like dopamine and serotonin and neurotransmitters and opioids and endogenous opioids. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter, which is associated with this incredible pleasure, right? So now let's look at that layer, that hedonic layer. Can you impact that second layer and create a disease state where you put someone in a kind of disease, right? By stimulating that layer, that hedonic layer. Well, yes, you can. If you maximally stimulate the receptors inside that second layer of the brain, the hedonic layer, you can create massive dopamine surges, serotonin surges, right? Through these endogenous opioid surges to create incredible pleasure. Now, bear with me. How would you do that, right? Cocaine. So people get addicted to cocaine. What do you think cocaine does? Why do you think people get addicted to cocaine? Well, it impacts that pleasure layer of the brain, the hedonic layer, creates these hedonic dopamine pleasure surges in that limbic system of the brain. And people feel incredibly happy when they do it, right? So cocaine, opioids, Tylenol 3, oxycodone. I was watching last night on CNN American Pain, right? Where they're talking about this incredible, the opioid crisis and fentanyl crisis. Why do you think people take fentanyl? Why do they get addicted? Alcohol addiction, nicotine addiction. What do you think it is doing? What do you think those things are doing? They're impacting that second layer of the brain, as a part of what they do at least, where they, you get these incredible pleasure surges in the brain of this happiness, this alcohol and nicotine and all this type of stuff. But okay, so you feel happy when, these things occur and, people take these type of drugs. How is that a disease? Why would you call that a disease, right? Well, what happens when you don't take it, right? So you're on one of these drugs or something like that, right? What happens when you stop taking the drug? Well, you get withdrawal, right? So when you withdraw from these drugs, suddenly, because that all those receptors, the dopamine receptors were stimulated maximally, right? And the way the body works is that if you keep stimulating something over and over and over again to the maximum level, well, when you withdraw that stimulus, then suddenly there's a down, the receptors, they go down. You get a deficit in terms of the dopamine and the dopamine receptors. And they try to down regulate. That's what happens. And so what happens now if the dopamine and those pleasure receptors and those endogenous opioids and those exogenous opioids are withdrawn? And you get this withdrawal, well, you feel like crap, right? You feel horrible. And so what happens? Well, look at the documentary American Pain, right? And what was happening in Florida and those two brothers, right? So at these medical clinics where they're prescribing, oxycodone, and you're getting these massive lines of people just, there, what happens? You need that stimulus again. That's human biology. Because of that dopamine deficit and the down regulation of the receptors, you're going to feel terrible. You're going to feel sad. You're going to feel depressed. You're not going to be able to do anything. You won't be able to focus. And so you need that re-stimulation again, and people will do anything. So we probably all know people who are addicted to some of these substances, right? So addiction, you become addicted. So that is a disease state, a drug addiction. So you're addicted, right? So, okay, we're talking about obesity. So you might be saying, Dr. Kabir, what are you talking about? Because yeah, those are drugs. But what does this second layer, this hedonic layer, and this idea of addiction, what does that have to do with obesity being called a disease? Because yes, you established that set point idea and the homeostatic mechanism. So what does this have to do with a disease? Well, guess what? Can food cause an addiction? Just like cocaine. Okay, now just bear me out. Now you might say I'm going off on a tangent, Dr. Kabir, and this is nuts and this is insane. Well, look, you're not going to believe this. This is incredible. So let's look at animals first before we go to human beings, okay? So all you got to go is to just Google it. You can Google all this stuff, or go to PubMed or Google Scholar, right? Go to PubMed and look at studies on animals, and of course it's usually always rats and mice, right, that they experiment on, right? So I'll give you a name of a study. This is just incredible, okay? And then I'll explain the study. The first study and by the way, there's so many of them, so I'm just giving you a couple of examples just in the interest of time, right? Cheesecake. We all love cheesecake, okay? Look at this. Cheesecake eating rats and the question of food addiction. This is a study which is published. This is in Nature Neuroscience, 2010, Epstein-Shaham. So this is not too long ago. This is like 14 to 13 years ago, right? I'll give you another example of a study. You can look all of this stuff up. Dopamine D2 receptors in addiction like reward dysfunction and compulsive eating in obese rats. So this is in Nature Neuroscience 2010 as well. Johnson and Kelly. There's lots of studies, okay? So what happens is with highly refined, high sugar content foods, what they have found and what has been shown over and over again in many animal studies, and you just look it up, you'll see it there, okay, is that you get this release of what? Dopamine and endogenous opioids. You're giving yourself these dopamine surges when you take these type of foods, right? So it's kind of like you're giving yourself Tylenol 3s through these type of foods. And I'll define the foods a little bit more, but just bear with me for a minute here. So it's kind of like you're giving yourself, self-injecting yourself through your mouth, right? Through these specific types of foods, these endogenous dopamine. It's like your, Oxycodone and Percocet and cocaine and all this type of stuff. So although I'm exaggerating a bit here, but just bear with me, okay? So what happened with rats, okay? So they gave these rats really highly sugary foods. And by the way, some of the researchers were trying to fatten up rats, and they were trying to give them sort of fatty foods and stuff, and they couldn't make them fat through the particular types of foods. So one researcher, he decided, well, why don't I give the rats maybe something like Fruit Loops and stuff like that? What happens to the rats? They become obese eating this type of stuff, okay? So in any case, in these studies, they gave these rats these really highly sugary types of foods, okay? And so what happens to these rats when they withdrew the high sugar content foods? Okay, so these are rats. The rats started exhibiting signs of classical withdrawal, drug withdrawal. Okay, this is incredible, right? So the rats, they exhibited teeth chattering. Okay, so the teeth are chattering. The rats were going through tremors, just like, it's incredible, right? So people know about DTs, after when you go through alcohol withdrawal and, these type of tremors. So you give these rats all this sugar food, and then you withdraw the food, they're undergoing tremors. Like, it's incredible, head shaking. This was, by the way, from a study, Princeton study, okay? Just imagine this, okay? This is from and I'm not talking about giving them, oxycodone and Percocet and cocaine. I'm talking about food, right? Just, it's incredible. Here's another study. Sugar on the brain. Study shows sugar dependence in rats. So this is by Bartley and Hobel. Again, you can look all of this stuff. It's all there. There's another study on rats, okay, with food. This is incredible. And we're just talking about this second layer of the brain, the hedonic pleasure limbic dopamine system of the brain, where can you create a disease state in which you're creating this type of addiction where you're addicted to something, and then when you withdraw that particular thing, then you go through this withdrawal type state, and so you have to do that same particular behavior or take that same drug in order to get that surge again and that happiness again. So here's another study, Florida study. This is like, look at this, right? So they conditioned rats, okay, and it was the study that I was talking about, the cheesecake, right? So they conditioned rats that if you want to have cheesecake, yummy cheesecake, right? If you want the cheesecake, then in order to get it, you have to go through electrical shocks, right? And these are rats. So these shocks they're really intense shocks, right? So why would you want to kind of almost electrocute yourself in order to get cheesecake? So they did this with these rats, and they said, okay, well, are the rats going to go for the cheesecake? and actually bear these electrical shocks. What did they show in this study? Incredible. The rats, in spite of the electrical shocks, they were willing to undergo the shocks in order to get the cheesecake. Okay? This is just incredible. Think about that. So now, what about humans? Are humans the same? Is our biology similar to a rat biology and mouse biology? And, is that possible that we could undergo something like or actually become addicted to food and foods? Is that possible? Right? And of course, there's a lot of controversy over this. Are these addictions or are these compulsions? So I'm not going to just bear with me on this whole idea of addiction, food addiction, human. Well, yeah. Again, just look this up. You can find this in PubMed, right? Where all the medical research, there's about 2,000 studies which are put into PubMed every single day. Okay, there's an incredible amount of medical information over there. Many doctors are just not able to keep up with all of these studies. Many doctors don't even know how to read studies. They don't even understand how to critically appraise studies and understand what can you believe, what do you have to reject, what are strong studies. But this is incredible. So here's a study. One study, it's called Brain, Dopamine, and Obesity. And this is an older study. This was published in the Lancet 2001. So this is a while ago, 22 years ago. Another study, 2008 study, Evidence for Sugar Addiction, 2008 study, Behavioral and Neurochemical Effects of Intermittent Excessive Sugar Intake. And this was published in Neuroscience Biobehavior, okay? So what is, now here's another study here, okay? Evidence that, okay, look at this, look at the title of this study. Evidence that intermittent excessive sugar intake causes endogenous opioid dependence. This was in Obesity Research 2002. And you can see a lot more recent studies as well, okay? What am I trying to say through all of this? So I'm talking about, is obesity a disease? We talked about the homeostatic, the hedonic. The brain, the human brain, is in a sense hardwired to want chemical reward, want this dopamine surges to reward itself by overeating. We're hardwired like this, especially when you're tempted with ultra-processed, highly palatable foods. Okay, just think about this hardwiring. This is just the way our brains are wired, okay? So let me make it very simple. When you binge eat, it's like you're giving yourself an antidepressant, okay? Just think about that. Or when you binge eat on certain types of foods, these incredibly hyper palatable, delicious, ultra processed, energy dense foods, it's like you're giving yourself these opioids, like some drugs, okay? Just imagine that. And so this, what they call a heightened mesolimbic, this dopamine reward response, that when you get this and you eat these type of foods, it can lead to a type of, you've probably seen feeding frenzies by animals and sharks. It can lead to this, right? Where people are just, you get that pleasure and you keep eating and eating and eating and eating. So, and again, you can find details. There's a wonderful textbook. It's called Obesity by Steelman and Westman, Dr. Westman. Okay. I've talked about this, the homeostatic hedonic. Okay, can you exploit human biology, knowing all of this stuff? Can you exploit the human biology? Can you exploit the brain of the human being where you create a disease state and you maximally stimulate this pleasure system of the brain, this limbic system. Can you do this? Can you create a sort of food addiction, if you will? Whether you want to call it an addiction or call it a compulsive eating or whatever. And I'm oversimplifying, right? Well, yes, you can exploit human biology. You can create a sort of food addiction type thing, okay? By manipulating the sugar, salt, fat content of a food. You can manipulate the food and create foods that maximally stimulate the brain. And you can actually test this by scanning a human brain, by manipulating the food, giving food to a human being, and see, well, what lights up in the brain? Does the dopamine system, that pleasure part of the brain, does it light up when you give certain foods and manipulate the foods? Okay, so you can exploit all of this and do this, right? So now the question is, wow, has anyone done that? Has anyone taken that step that, okay, well, let's try to create some sort of food addiction, okay? Now here we're getting to kind of some stuff that maybe you've never heard before, but I want to open your eyes because this is an obesity channel, right? And so my prime objective is I'm just trying to help society and help you to get that weight off and reverse and put your disease state into remission, okay? So has anyone exploited human biology in order to create this? Well, guess what? What do you think America's largest food companies have been doing for the last number of decades? For decades. What do you think they're doing? What do you think they've done? So they have been experimenting with foods, soft drinks. The vast majority of what you are seeing in department stores, the vast majority of it have been experimented ad lib. They experiment on the foods before they put them out and put them into marketing, right? Why do they do this? There's no conspiracy. So I'm not suggesting there's any type of conspiracy. I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. It's all about corporate greed, obviously. It's the bottom line, like how do we make lots of money, right? So these food companies, these huge, massive corporations have been experimenting of foods to try to see, well, can we make people, eat our foods and create this maximum pleasure point with our foods? They've been doing this for decades. It's well documented, okay? Foods, soft drinks. How do they experiment on this, okay? So the food companies, when they test the food, and the majority of what most people are eating now, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, right? And I'm going to explain this in the next video. My next video is going to be about why is there an exploding crisis of overweight and obesity and these type of lifestyle diseases and heart disease and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and all of these type of, and more than 50% of adults now being pre-diabetic or diabetic, okay? So the food companies, they experiment on foods, and what they are trying to reach is something called, what they call the bliss point. The bliss point. Think about it. That how do we get to that bliss point? Okay? So what they do is they create these ultra refined, highly processed, energy dense, refined carbohydrate, high sugar type foods, right? Think about all this, the cereals that you buy for your kids. What is all that? These air balls, sugar air puff balls, right? that you feed your kids and you say, oh, it's a healthy breakfast and my child needs breakfast. Okay, so just think about that. So, through the experiment to get to that bliss point, to get those flavor bursts, okay, what they call flavor bursts, that you eat and then you feel like, oh, I've got the munchies and I need to eat again. Just think about this, right? In fact, there is a food company that actually prides itself because they experimented on, they're experimenting on their particular brands of ice cream. So they said, okay, let's see what lights up, and they do these scans on the brains, and then what happens is that, oh my goodness, the same parts of the brain which light up with cocaine lights up with these types of ice creams. And so, think about cocaine and ice cream and the same part of the brain, that limbic system. And so this particular company, they said, well, look, our food is scientifically proven to make you feel happy. Yeah, it is, right? So think about that. So there's a place. Now you might say, okay, where's the evidence of all of this type of experimenting in food companies? Well, you can look this up. Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia. Okay, this is Philadelphia. The Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia. Maximum sensory pleasure stimulation. They experiment even on children when they're creating, these new foods for kids. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here by summarizing what I'm saying. Okay, we talked about the homeostatic mechanism. We talked about this hedonic layer of the brain. And so there are 3 layers of the brain: homeostatic, hedonic, executive. Okay, but the homeostatic layer's got this set point, and the hemostatic and the hedonic pleasure part, and the homeostatic has this set point. So how is this related? So bear with me on this, okay? This is how this occurs. The homeostatic layer of the brain, the lizard brain, if you will, and the hedonic layer, they synergistically feed off each other. They impact one another. So you become addicted, and it impacts the homeostatic mechanism. How does that happen? Okay. So it's kind of like this ratcheting effect, a ratcheting effect. So what happens is you get this, this designed food which has been manipulated to create the maximum pleasure surge in your brain, whether it's food or the soft drinks or all sorts of drinks which are being marketed today, right? So these foods, because they are so highly processed, your gut doesn't have to work in order to absorb it. It's like 100% absorbed, 100% absorbed. So you drink that particular drink, that particular soft drink, that's full of sugar, teaspoons and teaspoons and teaspoons of sugar, or that particular, snacks that, and the cookies and whatever it might be, and the brownies and this and that, right? And I'm exaggerating a bit, but bear with me. So 100% absorbed. You eat it, goes down into your gut, 100% absorbed. There's basically, your gut doesn't have to do any type of work because there's no fiber in it. There's no natural protein in it. There's nothing, right? So it just easily absorbed. That's why it tastes so good. That's why, right? So there's no, what they call, the thermic effect of food. There's no cost your body has to go through in absorbing these foods. Okay, so this is the first step. When that food is absorbed in your gut, okay, you get this massive insulin surge in your body because now you've got all this food. It's going into your portal system, the portal vein, which is a direct conduit to what organ? Oh my goodness, that central organ, the liver. So you get this portal, surge of sugar and carbohydrate, which is going through. no cost to your body, no expense for your body, so tasty. You get this massive insulin release, right? Well, what does insulin do? Well, we all know about insulin and diabetes. That's most people, that's all you think about. You think about diabetics, they have to take insulin injections. That's not all that insulin does. It is incredibly powerful. It's also a powerful growth factor, right? So it triggers the release of insulin-like growth factors, insulin-like growth factor 1, right? So it's a growth factor. So, and by the way, why do you think, in spite of all the successes of cancer type treatments, why do you think people are, there's an increase in stuff like colorectal cancer, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, gastrointestinal cancers, these type of hormonally sensitive types of cancers and all sorts of cancers? Why do you think? Well, what do you think the insulin is doing apart from just the stuff with the sugar? It's a growth factor. What do you think growth factors do? Well, if there are cancerous cells, which are always floating around in our bloodstreams, it's also stimulating your cancer cells to grow, right? So you get all sorts of cancers, right? So, okay, so now you've eaten this food, 100% absorbed, massive insulin release, okay? Growth factor released, right? Okay. Well, if insulin is released, a hormone, powerful hormone, major nutrient sensor in your body, and it's a growth factor, what do you think is going to happen to your appetite? Because it's a growth factor and stimulating things to grow, your appetite is going to go up. You've eaten, but your appetite is going to go up. What also happens? Because normally when you eat whole foods, natural foods, stuff that you naturally find in nature, that normally you have hormones which are released which quell your hunger. It tells you, okay, well, you've had enough, it's time to stop eating. So you get stuff which is released like GLP-1, right? We talked about semaglutide and liraglutide. You get stuff like cholecystokinin, which is released. You get amylin, which is released from the pancreas. You get oxyntomodulin. You get peptide YY. You get these hormones which are released that tell you stop eating. You got to stop eating. This stuff is just not released because you've eaten this highly processed food which has been absorbed essentially with no cost to your body. And so because of this lack of release of these hormones which interact with the homeostatic part of your brain and tell you, that hypothalamus telling you to stop eating, you don't get that. So you don't feel this satiety, this satiation. Your hunger is not gone. Like, just think about this, right? When you eat, donuts and things like that, like, is your hunger gone? You don't feel full because, you're just not stimulated. Those hormones that tell you to stop eating are not being released. Okay. So now there's no satiety on top of this, okay? Then on top of this, you get these massive dopamine surges, endogenous opioid surges, serotonin inside your pleasure part of your brain. Okay, so you get all of this type of stuff which is occurring when you've eaten this food. What happens? Well, insulin, when it's released, is a hormone that not only does it deal with sugar, it's a storage hormone. It tells you every time you get that surge of insulin, put on more weight, gain weight. So you eat that food and your weight goes up. Your body will not burn that fat and you put on more weight because that insulin is telling your fat it's time to store more fat, and you store more fat, so your weight goes up. And so in spite of, this your ideal weight or your set point should be maybe having been, as I started at the beginning, that it should be about 150 pounds. Instead, now because the weight has gone up, the set point is being ratcheted up like a ratcheting type phenomenon. And every time you eat those particular ultra processed foods, it goes up a little bit more. So maybe your weight, 20 years ago or 10 years ago was 150 pounds. But after that one meal, it's now 150.5. Next meal, a little bit more, until you get to now your set point has been driven up to 160. And maybe at that time you have a chance, you can do something about it more easily, but that food still keeps on coming in, it keeps on coming in until through this ratcheting phenomenon, before you know it, you're at 295 pounds, your set point has been driven up to 295 pounds. Then 297 pounds, then to 300 pounds, then to 302 pounds. And so the hedonic system is directly feeding into the homeostatic system through this pleasure that you're getting from the food that you're eating, driving up that weight, and they're just ping-ponging off each other in a synergistic type way. And it becomes a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle just going back and forth. And the weight just keeps coming on. Just think about what's happened over the last couple of years over this COVID crisis. And then what happens is that because you've maximally stimulated that dopamine system, you end up with this dopamine deficit, and then you got to eat it again. So now, okay, this is the culmination. Okay, so now we've talked about this homeostatic hedonic system, and so you're saying, well, Dr. Kabir, I need to lose weight. Basically, what's happening here is you're fighting against your homeostatic brain and your hedonic brain. Okay. And it's a fight. It's you versus you. And so essentially what you're doing is that you're only left now with the executive part of your brain. Okay, so we talked about those three layers. Now you have this executive part of the brain. The executive part of your brain is now your only protection against the other two layers. The executive part of the brain being like where you're able to, just say, well, I choose not to eat this particular food, or, I choose not to have such and such snack. That's all you're left with. It's that thin layer, if you will, that relatively very weak layer where that executive is fighting against the homeostatic and hedonic layer. But what happens when you've had a bad day or a long day at work, or you've had a disagreement or a conflict with a loved one, or with your spouse, or with your child, or with whatever, your parents? It's like the Titanic. It really is. The ability to make a decision and not eat those particular foods at those times when you're at the most vulnerable state, at that, the end of the day, it's truly like the tip of the iceberg in the Titanic. You don't see what's underneath the water, which is the vast majority of the iceberg, which is really your hedonic and hemostatic mechanism. It's you versus you. So next time somebody says, you're obese, it's your fault, or next time you see someone who is living with obesity and is fat, and is carrying all that extra weight, which you're not alone. It's like it's the majority of people now, right? It's not their fault. It's not your fault, right? Because you're dealing with millions of years of biology, billions of years of cellular biology, and you only have this executive part of the brain to fight against it. So next time you see someone who's struggling through this, have some compassion and some empathy and human mercy and dignity. Have some, some humanity in you. And it's more complicated than that. So in the next video, what I'm going to talk about is going to be that what has happened and why has this happened and why are so many people now overweight and obese, and how does all of this stuff, this disease state, tie in with that.